Now, what is the difference between whether you get baker's yeast or nutritional yeast? I mean, they're created from the same exact microbe. They're created from a yeast. Why would they be that different? Brewer's yeast is typically grown on beet sugar, whereas nutritional yeast is normally grown on molasses, which is the byproduct of sugarcane. And by the way, there's a lot of nutrition in molasses. There's trace minerals, there's vitamins. But the problem is there's also a lot of sugar. But when you put the yeast on it, the yeast eats the carbohydrate, the sugar, and also the nutrients. And those nutrients can then end up as a nutritional yeast product. Now, the same thing happens with brewer's yeast. When you're growing it on beet sugar, it's going to consume the sugar as well as the nutrition in that beet. The problem with, I think, over 90% of all beets, at least in the US, they're GMO, so they could potentially have traces of glyphosate, which is an herbicide. So this yeast is very interesting. It's a common microbe in our gut. And yeast is not a bad thing. We have friendly yeast and there's also unfriendly yeast. So as a part of our microbiome, we have a lot of different organisms that are in our gut, not just bacteria. It's when you start using antibiotics and you kill off the bacteria that then you get this overgrowth of this yeast. So as long as you don't stress out your microbes, you're fine. Those bacteria are there to keep the yeast in check and to keep them from overgrowing. But if there's anything that yeast love, it's sugar. So if you ever do have a yeast infection, you have to cut out the sugar if you ever want to get rid of your yeast. But this friendly yeast in our guts is pretty interesting because it actually helps defend against pathogens. It helps make glutathione, a very powerful antioxidant, and helps regulate cholesterol. And it helps build some immunity against certain pathogens as well. Now, when you consume either brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast, you're consuming an inactive yeast. It's not alive. So it's impossible for you to develop a yeast infection if you consume either baker's yeast or nutritional yeast. It's not going to happen. So what are the differences between baker's yeast or nutritional yeast? Baker's yeast is typically a byproduct of making beer. Nutritional yeast is more of a product that people take to enhance their nutrients. Now, there are several things in both of these yeasts that I want to do a little comparison. There is more protein in baker's yeast than nutritional yeast, that's for sure. But personally, I'm not trying to get my protein from yeast, but typically I get my protein from eggs, meats, dairy, cheese, things like that. Now, if we compare the B vitamins, nutritional yeast has more B vitamins than baker's yeast. And that's pretty much the main reason I consume nutritional yeast, for the B vitamins, but not just regular B vitamins, the natural B vitamins. So we can tap into that by consuming nutritional yeast. But I want to make a very important point. Many times they enhance, especially nutritional yeast, with synthetic B vitamins. Okay, they spike the B vitamins. They add B12, folic acid, and they're in a synthetic version. So I'm going to explain shortly why that is a very, very bad idea, especially for a significant population. In fact, if certain people consume these synthetic B vitamins, especially B12 and folic acid, they're going to have all sorts of negative reactions. And they'll definitely say that, oh, nutritional yeast may be worse, or they gave me a yeast infection or whatever, when in fact, it had nothing to do with that at all. Variation or change within our genes, a very specific part of your genes, okay, not the whole thing, but just a very small part of it, that if you consume certain amounts of synthetic B vitamins, you're not going to convert those into the natural forms. And that's going to create a lot of issues. So I'm just going to give you the name of this gene, and you can get more information about that if you're interested, but it's called the MTHFR gene. And the term for this variation or this difference in this gene is generally called polymorphic change. So basically that means it's just an altered shape. And if you have, based on genetic testing, this alteration in this specific gene, which by the way, 20 to 40% of whites and Hispanics in the US have this problem. And I think it's also 1 to 2% in the Black community. So it's actually much lower. But if you have this problem, okay, this problem in your genetics, you're only going to convert a fraction of these B vitamins. Specifically, it's like B12 and folic acid. Now, typically what will happen is you'll start having symptoms like racing mind, anxiety, like a hyper brain. You might have a problem sleeping. But the point is, because you don't have the enzyme to convert these hormones into the active form, you're going to be deficient in B12 and folic acid. And that is going to give you a lot of problems, especially with the cardiovascular system. You start building up more homocysteine. You can't recycle that, which leads to problems with your heart. You have problems with clots, not just on your arteries, but the deep veins as well, hardening of the arteries, dementia, mood disorders, an inability to detoxify things. So you're going to hold more toxins. So you can see there's a lot of problems with a defect in this gene. And that's all real interesting, but that's a side note. I want to get back to this topic of when you consume yeast that is fortified or enriched, they're enriching it with synthetic B vitamins, usually B12, folic acid, and B6, and other B vitamins. And that is going to create a problem. So I would recommend, if you're going to consume either brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast, to always get them unfortified, because those yeast made these forms of B vitamins in a natural form. And even if you don't have a problem with this gene, these B vitamins are wonderful to reduce stress, because it is just so hard to find a natural form of B vitamin in our food. Now, it's in grains, but the problem with grains is that they have other problems like gluten and carbohydrates. So yeast is a really good source of B vitamins, and you can get a good amount of B vitamins from baker's yeast. It's just that nutritional yeast has a little bit more. Now, as far as a woman who is breastfeeding, a lot of times they'll take nutritional yeast to help fortify and increase the breast milk production. Nutritional yeast can actually work better than brewer's yeast because it has more B vitamins, and it's usually the B vitamins. It could also be the combination of the trace minerals and other things in that product that's doing it, but the B vitamins are a significant factor in increasing the quality of breast milk. Now, there's another interesting compound called beta-glucan. That is a product that does help regulate cholesterol. It does help with your blood sugars, and that is present in both nutritional yeast and brewer's yeast. And another interesting thing about this topic is that plants actually get a significant amount of their nutrition from these microbes. In fact, they eat the microbes that have this nutrition in them. They extract the nutrition, and they will also spit out part of this bacteria that without a cell wall that has to kind of recombine and do this whole cycle. So there's this whole exchange going on in the soil between the microbe and the plant. And this is why a plant typically is not a pure vegan. Plants, to my knowledge, don't eat vegetables, but they definitely eat bacteria. So to me, it's very fascinating to just study the yeast and the bacteria of what's going on in their universe, because it's quite interesting. You have to realize that the DNA in our bodies, okay, the code that makes certain proteins, the code that makes certain enzymes, that same code, that same machinery is in plants as well as in bacteria and yeast. This is why they can even make certain phytonutrients and antioxidants, because they have the machinery that is the same in our bodies. So when we eat this yeast, we're extracting nutrients that are made from this machine that they have that can actually make B vitamins from the environment. And because this machinery is built on certain genes that we have, we can utilize that nutrition and those phytonutrients. Now, since we're on the topic of B vitamins, which is a fascinating topic, if you haven't seen this video on B vitamins that I've done at one of my summits, check it out. I put it up right here.